For 52 years, the world believed she was gone. Buried, perhaps. Murdered, maybe. Forgotten, certainly. Her name was Lucy Ann Johnson, a mother of two from Surrey, British Columbia, whose quiet disappearance in 1961 haunted her family and bewildered investigators for generations. For decades, her story gathered dust inside a cold case file, sealed by time and silence. Her husband was suspected of killing her. Her children grew up believing she was dead. And the small suburban home they once shared became a monument to unanswered questions. But then, in the summer of 2013, something unthinkable happened. A phone call, from hundreds of miles away in the Yukon, changed everything. A stranger's voice on the other end of the line said words no one thought they'd ever hear again. "I think the woman you're looking for is my mother." At that moment, the dead came back to life. A woman missing for more than half a century, declared long gone, was suddenly found alive. Breathing. Living under another name. And carrying a secret that had outlived everyone who had searched for her. This is not a ghost story. It's a story of escape, of silence, and of survival. Because sometimes, the people we lose aren't taken from us, they walk away, disappearing not into death, but into another life entirely. You're watching The Found Files, where forgotten disappearances find their voice again. And before we open this one, take a second to think about it. Right now, there's someone out there who still doesn't know what happened to the person they love. A case that's gone cold. A name that's been erased. If you believe their stories deserve to be heard, if you believe truth deserves a heartbeat, then make sure you're subscribed. Because every time you do, you help bring one more lost soul back into the light. Before she became a mystery whispered through the decades, Lucy Ann Johnson was simply a young woman trying to build a quiet life in a growing corner of British Columbia. Born in 1935 in Skagway, Alaska, Lucy came from a world of open skies and rugged mountains, a child of the North, where winters were long and communities were close. She carried that gentle, northern strength with her when she moved to Canada, chasing the promise of something better. By the late 1950s, she had settled in Surrey, a town just beginning to sprawl beyond its farmlands, where families built modest homes, and neighbors knew each other's names. There, she met Marvin Johnson. To many, they looked like the perfect post-war couple, a young man with plans, a smiling woman who seemed to make a home feel warm. Together, they built a life, brick by brick, moment by moment. They had two children, Linda and Daniel, the kind of children every mother dreams of, curious, soft-spoken, full of light. Neighbors would see Lucy in the mornings, waving to them from her front steps, her children at her side. A gentle woman, always kind, always polite. The kind who baked too many cookies and offered them to anyone passing by. But behind those gentle smiles, behind the thin curtains of their tidy little home, something else was happening, something only Lucy could feel. Those who knew her later said she had a quiet sadness in her eyes, as though she was always halfway somewhere else. There were whispers of control, of arguments that lasted long after the neighbors had gone to sleep. Of a woman who seemed to grow smaller in her own home with each passing year. Still, she endured. Because that's what women were taught to do in those years, to stay, to smile, to survive. And so, Lucy did what she'd always done. She cared for her children, she cooked dinner, she kept the peace. To anyone looking in from the outside, her world was normal. Perfect, even. But in silence, she was already dreaming of a different kind of life, one where she could breathe, one where her name wouldn't feel like a cage. And in the autumn of 1961, as the leaves began to fall across Surrey, that quiet longing would lead her to do something no one ever expected. Because soon, Lucy Ann Johnson would simply disappear. It was the autumn of 1961 when the world around Lucy Ann Johnson fell silent. No one knew it then, but those crisp September days would be the last time anyone in Surrey, British Columbia, would ever see her. Neighbors remembered small details, a smile exchanged over the fence, the sound of children playing in the yard, the smell of wood smoke curling through the evening air. But soon, that house at the end of the street grew still. Lucy stopped waving. The laughter faded. And then, she was gone. Days passed. Then weeks. Seasons changed, and still, no word. No note. No goodbye. It was as though Lucy had been swallowed by the quiet. But here is where the story twists, not because she vanished, but because of what came next. She wasn't reported missing. Not right away. Not even soon. It took 4 years before anyone picked up the phone. In May of 1965, Lucy's husband, Marvin Johnson, finally walked into a police station and told officers that his wife had been missing since 1961. He claimed she had simply walked out, left the home, the children, everything behind. To the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the story made no sense. How could a mother vanish for 4 years before anyone cared to notice? Why would a husband wait so long to speak? The questions piled higher than the answers. Detectives searched the Johnson home, combing through rooms that had long been frozen in time. They brought shovels to the backyard. They dug through the soil where the garden once bloomed. Somewhere in the dirt, they expected to find the truth: bones, clothing, a trace of the woman who had once lived there. But there was nothing. Nobody. No sign of struggle. Not a single clue. Only silence. The neighbors whispered behind drawn curtains. The police suspected Marvin, but with no evidence, no witnesses, and no confession, there was nothing they could do. The file was opened. The case was stamped unsolved. And over the years, Lucy's name faded into the long list of missing women whose stories would never be told. For her daughter, Linda, the years that followed were filled with confusion. She was just a little girl when her mother disappeared, left to wonder if she had been abandoned, or if something darker had happened within those walls. She would grow up never knowing the truth. And Marvin, the man who had waited 4 years to report his wife missing, would live out the rest of his days under a cloud of suspicion. By the time he passed away, Lucy's disappearance had become an afterthought, a mystery that belonged to another time. But the truth? The truth was still alive. Hidden in another corner of the same country, where Lucy herself was breathing, walking, and building a life no one knew existed. For nearly half a century, Lucy and Johnson existed as both alive and gone. To the world, she was a missing woman, her name buried deep in yellowed police files, her photo fading on forgotten bulletin boards. But somewhere, far from Surrey, far from the garden where police once dug for her bones, Lucy was breathing beneath a different sky. No one knew it, but she had quietly slipped into a new life, a life built from the ashes of another. After leaving British Columbia, Lucy found refuge in the Yukon, a place as remote and rugged as the secrets she carried. The North was vast and silent, a land that didn't ask questions, where people could start again without explanation. There, she became someone new. A woman without a past, without judgment, without the weight of the life she'd left behind. Years blurred into decades. The world changed, wars ended, cities grew, technology rose, but Lucy remained a whisper of a woman, tucked away in the cold corners of Canada's northern wilderness. She lived quietly, working odd jobs, raising another family, watching snow fall each year over a life no one connected to the missing woman from Surrey. No one there called her Lucy Johnson. No one asked why she never spoke of her childhood, her parents, or the little girl she once held in her arms. Perhaps she told herself it was for the best, that leaving was survival, that silence was peace. Back in British Columbia, the years turned her name into a ghost story. Her daughter, Linda, grew up haunted by the absence, by the empty chair at every birthday, by the lullabies that stopped mid-song. She would spend her adult years chasing faint memories, the scent of her mother's perfume, the warmth of her hand, the image of her turning away one last time. Lucy had become both a wound and a mystery. By the 1970s, the case had gone cold. By the 1980s, it was forgotten. But time has a strange way of circling back, of dragging old stories into the light. In 2013, more than 50 years after Lucy vanished, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police reopened her file. A cold case unit took a second look at the strange, unfinished story of the woman from Surrey. Detectives posted her photograph online, a faded black and white image of a young mother whose smile belonged to another lifetime. They asked the public for help, for any memory, any thread. And in a small home, now grown and full of her own memories, Linda Johnson, the daughter Lucy left behind, saw her mother's face staring back at her from the screen. She had spent her whole life wondering where Lucy had gone. Now, she was ready to find out. For 52 years, Lucy and Johnson's name had been carved into silence. But sometimes, even the quietest names echo long enough to find their way home. In the spring of 2013, Lucy's daughter, Linda, decided to do something that would change everything. She placed an ad in the Yukon News. The words were simple, almost trembling. "I'm looking for my mother, Lucy Ann Johnson. Missing since 1961. Born October 14, 1935. Originally from Skagway, Alaska." It was a plea, not to law enforcement, not to the press, but to the unknown. To anyone who might still remember a woman who had once been loved, once been lost. And then, the phone rang. A voice on the other end said something that didn't seem real. They had read the ad, and they knew Lucy. They said she was alive. Living in the Yukon. Not a ghost, not a name on a cold caseboard, alive. The news spread like a ripple through time. For those who had long buried her in their hearts, it felt like hearing from the dead. Investigators confirmed it soon after, the fingerprints, the birth date, the small details only Lucy would know. There was no mistake. After more than half a century of silence, Lucy Ann Johnson had been found. No one could fully grasp it, how a woman presumed dead had lived a full, quiet life just a few hundred miles away. How she'd raised another family, watched her hair turn silver, while her daughter grew up believing she'd been abandoned, or worse. When reporters asked Lucy why she had disappeared, she didn't offer the kind of answer that satisfies headlines. She spoke softly, almost apologetically. She said she had left because her marriage had been troubled, because she'd felt trapped, because she had wanted a different life. And so, she built one. To some, it sounded like an explanation. To others, an open wound. But to Linda, the daughter who had spent her whole life searching, none of that mattered. Because now she had what she never thought she'd find again, her mother's voice on the other end of the line. It wasn't anger that came first. It was disbelief. Then tears. Then relief was so sharp it almost hurt. After 52 years, the truth had come home. And yet, the truth brought something else with it, the weight of time. Because while Lucy had been living her second life in the north, the world she left behind had kept turning. People had died. Memories had faded. The children had grown old. But somehow, the thread that connected mother and daughter had held firm, stretched thin across decades, but never broken. Lucy had never imagined she'd be found. Linda had never imagined her mother was still alive. Yet, here they were, two lives divided by time, standing once again in each other's shadow. The road to the Yukon felt endless, miles of frozen silence, tall evergreens swaying in the northern wind, the kind of landscape that holds its secrets tight. For Linda Johnson, that journey wasn't just a trip north. It was a passage through decades, through grief, confusion, and the ache of a question she had carried since childhood. Why did you leave me? When she finally arrived, there was no grand moment, no media frenzy, no flashing cameras. Just two women, a mother and a daughter, standing face to face for the first time in 52 years. Time seemed to stop. Lucy stood smaller than Linda remembered from her childhood memories, her once dark hair now silver, her eyes softer, lined with stories that words could never hold. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was the loudest sound in the room. Then came the tears, quiet, heavy, unstoppable. They didn't talk about the years apart, or the rumors of death, or the empty space where birthdays and Christmases should have been. They simply held each other. Two lives, once separated by distance, fear, and choices, now pressed together again, as if time had folded back on itself. Lucy whispered her daughter's name like it was a prayer she thought she'd forgotten. Linda, in that moment, was no longer the grown woman who had spent her life searching. She was a little girl again, held in the arms of the mother she thought she'd lost forever. It wasn't a perfect reunion. There were too many years, too many wounds that time couldn't erase. But it was real, painfully, beautifully real. Lucy spoke of her second family, her life in the Yukon, the grandchildren Linda had never known existed. Linda listened, not as a detective, but as a daughter piecing together fragments of a story that had haunted her dreams. For the first time, she understood that her mother hadn't vanished into thin air. She had walked away, from pain, from control, from the woman she used to be. And yet, even after all that, there was love. Quiet, complicated love. The world often measures closure as an ending, a solved case, a name crossed off a list. But for Linda and Lucy, closure was something gentler, a single embrace that said, "We made it." When their story reached the public, it didn't read like a crime. It read like a miracle, one that had waited half a century to be found. The reunion wasn't about justice. It was about forgiveness. Not for the past that couldn't be undone, but for the chance to live with what remained. And as the sun dipped over the Yukon hills that day, casting gold over the snow, Lucy and Linda sat together, mother and daughter, silent, but no longer lost. For them, time had finally stood still. For more than half a century, Lucy and Johnson was a mystery frozen in time, a name whispered by police, a face blurred by age, a story thought to be over. But the truth, when it finally surfaced, wasn't one of violence or death. It was one of survival. Of silence. Of a woman who disappeared not because she was taken, but because she chose to begin again. And yet, the cost of that choice rippled through generations. A daughter who spent her life searching for a mother she thought she'd buried. A family that lived in the shadow of questions no one could answer. A world that had moved on, until one ad, one chance, one heartbeat, brought it all rushing back. Lucy's story reminds us that behind every missing person's case is a human being, flawed, frightened, and fragile, and behind every search is someone who refuses to stop hoping. In the end, the Found Files isn't about crime. It's about connection. About what happens when lost stories finally find their way home. When Lucy and her daughter sat together after all those years, there were no perfect explanations. No tidy endings. Just two people, separated by time, bound again by love. Maybe that's what healing looks like, not rewriting the past, but making peace with it. Some stories end in tragedy. Some in triumph. And then there are the rare few, like Lucy's, that end in quiet forgiveness. Because even after decades of silence, there's still a chance for truth to breathe again. And somewhere out there right now, another family waits for that same miracle, a knock on the door, a phone call, a name rediscovered after too many years of not knowing. If Lucy's story moved you, if it reminded you that no case is too cold, no distance too wide, and no silence too long, then don't scroll away. Subscribe to the Found Files. Because every time you do, you help us keep these stories alive, the ones the world has forgotten, the ones still waiting to be found. And who knows, maybe the next file we open will be the one that brings someone you know back home.